ADX Florence explained, inside America's Supermax hell. What it's really like inside ADX Florence. In the high desert of southern Colorado, where the wind scrapes across open land and the mountains cut a jagged line against the sky, sits a fortress built not to rehabilitate, not to reform, but to contain. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence, was designed for one purpose: absolute control. This is the most secure federal prison in the United States. Inside these concrete walls are men considered too dangerous for any other prison in the country. Terrorists, organized crime leaders, serial killers, prison gang shot callers, inmates who assaulted staff in other institutions. But what does most secure really mean? What does a day look like when your world measures 7 feet by 12? And what happens to the human mind when silence becomes your only companion? To understand ADX Florence, you have to understand why it was built and what went wrong before it existed. What led to its creation is darker than most people realize. And what happens inside may be even more unsettling. In the 1980s, the federal prison system was facing a crisis. High-security facilities were struggling to control violent inmates who continued orchestrating crimes from behind bars. The tipping point came in 1983 at the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. 2 correctional officers were murdered by inmates in separate incidents on the same day. The response was immediate and severe. Marion went into permanent lockdown. That lockdown became the blueprint. The Bureau of Prisons concluded that certain inmates required more than maximum security. They required total isolation, a facility where violence could not spread, where communication could not travel, where power structures could be dismantled by force of architecture alone. ADX Florence opened in 1994. Its design reflected lessons learned from Marion. It was engineered to eliminate opportunity for escape, for assault, for coordination. But eliminating opportunity also meant eliminating human contact. And that decision would define everything that followed. ADX Florence is part of the Federal Correctional Complex in Florence, Colorado. But unlike the medium and high-security institutions nearby, ADX stands apart, physically and operationally. The prison is often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The comparison is dramatic, but the isolation is real. Its perimeter includes multiple layers of fencing, razor wire, motion detectors, surveillance cameras, and armed guard towers. Movement inside is controlled electronically. Doors open remotely. There are no bars on the cells. Instead, thick concrete walls and solid steel doors with narrow slots control visibility and access. Escape from ADX is not simply unlikely. It is considered virtually impossible. But escape is not the real story. The real story begins once the steel door closes behind an inmate for the first time. The typical cell in the general population unit at ADX measures approximately 7 by 12 feet. Inside, there's a poured concrete bed, a thin mattress, a small fold-down desk, a stool attached to the floor, a combination stainless steel sink and toilet. The window is just 4 inches wide, angled so that inmates cannot see the surrounding facility. Only sky. The door is solid steel with a small slot for food trays. Inmates spend approximately 23 hours a day inside this space. Meals are passed through the slot. Conversations with staff are brief and controlled. If recreation is granted, it usually takes place alone in a small concrete enclosure, sometimes described as a dog run, with high walls and a metal grate above. The design ensures minimal human contact. For some, that silence is punishment. For others, it becomes something else entirely. And what happens to the mind in that silence is where the story begins to shift. The Bureau of Prisons describes ADX as housing inmates who pose the greatest risk to staff, other inmates, and the security of the institution. Many of the men sent here arrive after violent incidents in other federal prisons. Assaults on officers, stabbings, leadership roles in prison gangs. Others are transferred because of national security concerns. Among those who have been housed at ADX are convicted terrorists, high-level organized crime figures, and individuals responsible for large-scale acts of violence. The common factor is not the crime alone. It is the perceived, ongoing threat. ADX is not designed for temporary discipline. It is designed for long-term containment. Some inmates remain here for years, others for decades, and for many, the pathway out is not clearly defined. That uncertainty, how long, how far, how permanent, creates its own form of tension. A typical day begins early. Lights on. Count conducted. Inmates are required to stand for formal counts. Compliance is mandatory. Breakfast is delivered through the food slot. Contact with staff is brief. Communication is limited to essential instructions. Programming is minimal compared to traditional prisons. Some inmates have access to reading materials, educational packets, or religious texts. Television is permitted in certain units, but programming is controlled and earned through behavior. Movement outside the cell is tightly scheduled. When an inmate leaves his cell, he is typically handcuffed through the slot, then escorted by multiple officers. Even showers are conducted alone in secured stalls. Everything is structured to prevent physical interaction. But structure does not eliminate hierarchy. Even in isolation, power finds a way to exist. And the way it operates inside ADX is quieter, but no less real. Recreation time, when granted, usually lasts about an hour. Alone, the recreation yard is not a traditional yard. There are no open fields, no basketball courts filled with movement. Instead, there are individual concrete enclosures. High walls, a patch of sky above. Some inmates exercise. Others simply stand and breathe air that does not pass through a vent. For individuals accustomed to constant stimulation, this hour can feel disorienting. For others, it becomes the only marker of time passing. Because inside ADX, time behaves differently. Days blend together. Weeks dissolve. And when there is little change in environment, the mind begins to create its own. What forms in that silence is something rarely discussed openly, but former inmates have described it in detail. Prolonged solitary confinement has been studied extensively. Psychologists have documented effects that include anxiety, depression, hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive decline. Several lawsuits have challenged conditions at ADX, particularly regarding inmates with serious mental illness. In 2015, a class action lawsuit resulted in a settlement requiring changes in how mentally ill prisoners are identified and treated within the facility. Critics argue that extreme isolation exacerbates psychological instability. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX is necessary for institutional safety and that procedures are in place to monitor inmate well-being. But monitoring does not erase the fundamental reality. Human beings are social creatures, and ADX systematically removes that social element. What happens when a man speaks to no one for days at a time? When eye contact becomes rare? When physical touch is limited to restraints? The answers are not uniform, but they are often unsettling. Control at ADX is layered. Inmates are assigned to units based on behavior and threat level. The most restrictive is known as the control unit. Others include the Special Security Unit and the General Population Unit. Privileges are earned through compliance. Infractions can result in further restrictions. Mail is screened. Phone calls are limited and monitored. Visits, when allowed, occur through thick glass partitions. Communication between inmates is intentionally difficult. Yet coded messages, shouted conversations through vents, and subtle signals have been documented. Even in near-total isolation, humans attempt to connect. And that persistence of communication, of identity, is what keeps ADX from being simply a building. It becomes a psychological battleground, not between inmates, but between the environment and the individual. From the outside, ADX Florence appears quiet. No visible chaos. No riots spilling into news headlines. No dramatic escapes. Its effectiveness is often measured in absence of violence within its walls. But effectiveness depends on perspective. For administrators, it is a tool of control. For some victims' families, it represents final containment. For inmates, it is a reality measured in locked doors and long nights. And for the correctional officers who work there, it is an environment requiring constant vigilance. Staff operate under strict procedures. Multiple officers escort high-risk inmates. Weapons are controlled. Movement is calculated. Because while ADX is built for control, it houses individuals who once exercised significant power elsewhere. And power, even when confined, does not disappear easily. What happens when leaders of criminal organizations are placed in near-total isolation? The answer reveals a different kind of struggle, one fought without visible weapons. The struggle for relevance. For many inmates, outside communication is the only remaining connection to identity. Letters, legal documents, occasional monitored phone calls. Mail is screened carefully. Any attempt to pass coded instructions can result in disciplinary action. Several high-profile inmates have been accused in the past of directing criminal enterprises from prison. ADX was specifically designed to prevent that, and in many cases, it has succeeded. But containment comes at a cost. Years in a cell where conversation is limited can alter perception. Former inmates have described losing track of days. Some have spoken about talking to themselves to maintain mental clarity. Others have described extreme discipline, creating routines, memorizing books, exercising rigorously to hold on to structure. Survival inside ADX is not about physical strength. It is about mental endurance. And not everyone adapts the same way. When night falls, the routine does not soften. Counts continue. Lights may dim, but they do not disappear completely. Silence deepens. For some inmates, nighttime is the hardest part of the day. There is no distraction, no task, no scheduled movement, just concrete, steel, breath. In that stillness, memories surface. Regret, anger, denial. Each can grow louder in isolation. ADX Florence was constructed to solve a problem of violence and control. It has done that, but it has also created a different environment, one where punishment is measured not by noise or force, but by absence. Absence of movement, absence of touch, absence of ordinary human interaction. Whether that absence is justified depends on perspective, but its impact is undeniable. And as this story continues, the question becomes more complicated, because beyond the architecture and routines lies something harder to quantify. What does long-term isolation do to a person's future? Can someone emerge from ADX unchanged? Or does the experience permanently alter the way they see the world? That is where the next chapter leads, into the personal accounts, the legal battles, and the long-term consequences that continue to shape the debate around America's most secure prison. And what those stories reveal may be more complex than the walls themselves. ADX Florence was not simply built as a prison. It was engineered as a response. After the violence at Marion and a growing number of assaults across high-security federal institutions, the Bureau of Prisons sought a permanent solution. The idea was straightforward. If certain inmates repeatedly disrupted facilities, remove them from every possible source of disruption. The result was a facility designed around control through architecture. Cells were positioned to prevent face-to-face interaction. Windows were angled so inmates could not identify their location within the complex. Doors were electronically operated from secure control rooms. Movement paths were intentionally indirect, reducing predictability. This was not improvisation. It was planning on a granular level. But architecture alone does not explain ADX. The real story lies in who is sent there and why. Because placement in ADX is not automatic. It is a process. And once someone enters that process, returning to a lower security environment can take years. Inmates are typically transferred to ADX following a disciplinary hearing or classification review. The reasons vary. Some assaulted correctional officers. Others orchestrated violence inside previous institutions. Some are considered national security threats. Others were involved in organized criminal networks that extended beyond prison walls. Once designated for ADX, an inmate enters the most restrictive phase of confinement. But not every inmate remains in maximum isolation indefinitely. ADX operates a step-down program. This program is often described as the only structured path out. What that path looks like, and how difficult it is to walk, reveals much about how the facility measures behavior, compliance, and risk. And it's here that the system becomes even more controlled. The step-down program is divided into phases. Inmates begin in highly restrictive conditions. Over time, if they demonstrate consistent compliance with rules, they may earn incremental privileges. These can include increased recreation time, limited small group interaction, or additional access to programming. But progress is slow. Behavioral reports are closely reviewed. Any infraction can halt advancement or reverse it. For some inmates, especially those serving life sentences, motivation becomes complicated. If release into the community is not an option, what does progress mean? In that environment, compliance becomes less about hope for freedom and more about stability. Because even small changes, such as slightly longer recreation periods, can represent significant shifts inside ADX. And yet, not everyone experiences the step-down system the same way. Some move through it. Others remain in isolation for years. One of the most defining aspects of ADX is visual restriction. In traditional prisons, inmates can often see open yards, other housing units, or movement across the compound. At ADX, visibility is intentionally limited. Windows are positioned to allow light but prevent orientation. From inside, an inmate cannot see the perimeter fence. He cannot see other inmates exercising. He cannot even see the full horizon. This design reduces the possibility of coordinated action, but it also removes spatial awareness. Over time, disconnection from environment can deepen psychological strain. Some former inmates have described losing a sense of direction, both physically and emotionally. When your world is reduced to concrete walls and a narrow strip of sky, perspective shifts. The question becomes, how long can the human mind adapt to that environment before something changes? The answer depends on the individual and on what they carry with them into that cell. Among the inmates housed at ADX over the years have been individuals convicted of acts that reshaped national security policy. Convicted terrorists, foreign and domestic, have been placed in its special security unit. The reasoning is clear: prevent communication that could inspire or direct future violence. Isolation at that level is not only about discipline, it is about containment of ideology. These inmates often face special administrative measures, known as SAMs. SAMs impose additional restrictions on communication, including limits on attorney visits, monitored legal correspondence, and near total control over outside contact. The goal is prevention. But critics argue that extreme communication restrictions can interfere with legal rights and mental stability. Supporters argue that without such measures, security risks remain too high. In this environment, ADX becomes more than a prison. It becomes part of a broader national security framework, and the debate surrounding it grows more complex. Legal challenges to ADX have shaped parts of its operations. In 2012, a group of inmates filed a lawsuit alleging that conditions, particularly for prisoners with mental illness, violated constitutional protections. The case resulted in a settlement requiring reforms, including improved mental health screening and monitoring. The Bureau of Prisons agreed to changes without admitting wrongdoing. These reforms included mental health step-down units and additional clinical oversight. But litigation did not eliminate controversy. Human rights organizations continue to criticize long-term solitary confinement. Correctional officials continue to defend ADX as a necessary tool. Between those positions lies an ongoing tension. Is extreme isolation a last resort or an overused solution? The answer depends on how one defines safety. And safety, in the context of ADX, has multiple meanings. Life at ADX is not defined only by inmates. Correctional officers operate within strict protocols. Multiple staff members escort high-risk prisoners. Use of force policies are clearly outlined. Training emphasizes de-escalation, but also readiness. Working in an environment of near-total isolation presents its own psychological pressures. Officers must maintain professionalism in prolonged quiet. There are no large group movements, no bustling yards. Instead, there is repetition. Cell checks, counts, escorts, day after day. The structure protects staff, but it also requires constant attention to detail. Because in a facility built to prevent unpredictability, even small deviations matter. Inside ADX, survival is different from survival in traditional prisons. There are no large inmate populations forming visible hierarchies. No communal dining halls where alliances are negotiated. But influence still exists. Reputation follows inmates from other facilities. Status from prior gang leadership or criminal networks does not vanish overnight. Yet in isolation, influence has fewer outlets. Some inmates focus inward. They read extensively, study law, develop rigid daily routines. Others struggle. The difference often lies in coping strategies. Because in an environment where external control is absolute, internal control becomes everything. And that internal battle is rarely visible from the outside. Seasons change in Florence, Colorado. Snow falls. Summers bring intense sun across the high desert. Inside the recreation enclosures, inmates experience weather in fragments. A gust of cold air, a square of sunlight, but never full immersion. This partial exposure reinforces the sense of separation. Time passes, but life outside continues beyond view. Family members age. Children grow up. World events unfold. And inside ADX, the routine remains largely unchanged. The distance between those realities can widen over years. That widening gap becomes one of the most profound aspects of long-term confinement. For some inmates, tracking time becomes essential. Marking days, counting weeks, setting personal goals within strict limitations. Without structure, monotony can blur perception. With structure, monotony can be managed. Former inmates have described creating elaborate mental exercises to maintain clarity, memorizing passages, learning new languages from books, performing mathematical drills. These routines are not hobbies. They are survival mechanisms. Because when external stimulation is minimal, internal engagement becomes a defense against deterioration. And deterioration, in prolonged isolation, is a documented risk. The phrase, America's most secure prison, carries weight. But security is not a single concept. It includes physical barriers, procedural safeguards, classification systems, and psychological management. ADX embodies all of these. Its supporters argue that it prevents violence not only inside its walls, but across the federal prison system. By isolating the most disruptive individuals, they argue, other institutions become safer. Its critics argue that extreme isolation may prevent immediate violence while creating long-term psychological harm. Both perspectives acknowledge one fact: ADX is effective at containment. The unresolved question is what containment does to a person over decades. Imagine spending year after year in a room where every object is fixed, where the walls do not change, where conversations are brief and transactional, where physical contact is limited to restraints. For some inmates, that reality lasts far longer than the public realizes. Transfers out of ADX are possible, but rare without sustained compliance. And even when inmates are moved to lower security facilities, reintegration into more social environments can be jarring. After prolonged isolation, noise itself can feel overwhelming. That transition raises another question. If ADX removes individuals from violence, how does it prepare them, if at all, for life beyond isolation? The answer is not straightforward. ADX Florence stands in contrast to the openness around it. Miles of land, clear skies, mountains in the distance. Inside, confinement is absolute. Outside, space is vast. That contrast is symbolic. It represents the separation between the institution and the world it serves. For many Americans, ADX exists only as a headline, a name associated with the most serious federal offenders. But within its walls, it is a daily lived experience. for inmates, for staff, for families on the outside, and its existence forces a difficult conversation about punishment, safety, and the limits of isolation. Visitation at ADX, when permitted, occurs through secure glass barriers. No physical contact. Conversations monitored. For families, these visits can be emotionally complex. Seeing someone confined in extreme security reinforces finality. For inmates, such visits can be grounding or painful reminders of distance. Communication restrictions vary based on classification and administrative measures. In the most restrictive units, even these limited visits are rare. Isolation extends beyond the cell. It reaches outward. Visitation at ADX, when permitted, occurs through secure glass barriers. No physical contact. Conversations monitored. For families, these visits can be emotionally complex. Seeing someone confined in extreme security reinforces finality. For inmates, such visits can be grounding or painful reminders of distance. Communication restrictions vary based on classification and administrative measures. In the most restrictive units, even these limited visits are rare. Isolation extends beyond the cell. It reaches outward. Rules inside ADX are clear. Infractions carry consequences. Loss of privileges. Delayed step-down progress. Extended restrictions. Compliance is not optional. It is the only measurable path forward. But compliance under extreme isolation raises ethical and psychological questions. Is behavior in such an environment a true measure of rehabilitation? Or is it a measure of adaptation? The distinction matters, because ADX is not simply a holding facility. It reflects a philosophy that certain risks can only be managed through separation. 3 decades after it opened, ADX Florence remains operational under the same core principles. Extreme control, layered security, minimal interaction. It has not experienced a successful escape. Major internal violence is rare. From a strictly security-based perspective, its mission has been fulfilled. Yet debates about solitary confinement continue nationally and internationally. Some states have reduced its use. Federal policy has evolved in certain areas. But ADX remains the endpoint for the most serious federal cases. And as long as the federal system classifies certain inmates as unmanageable elsewhere, the facility will remain part of that system. In the end, ADX Florence is defined less by what happens there and more by what is not. There are no large-scale riots, no chaotic cell blocks, no visible power struggles. Instead, there is silence, routine, isolation. For some, that silence represents safety. For others, it represents a line crossed. The reality inside ADX is neither theatrical nor dramatic in the traditional sense. It is methodical, and that methodical nature is precisely what makes it powerful. ADX Florence was built to answer a problem of control. It did so through architecture, policy, and isolation. What it created is a facility unlike any other in the federal system. Inside its walls, days are measured in counts and compliance. Movement is calculated. Conversation is limited. The outside world is visible only as a strip of sky. Whether ADX represents necessary protection or excessive punishment depends on perspective. But its impact on those who live and work there is undeniable. Concrete does not speak. Steel doors do not argue. They simply close. And when they do, the silence that follows can last for years. The question that remains is not whether ADX works. It is what that work means for justice, for safety, and for the human mind.